Hello and welcome to another LeetCode problem. So today we're going to be doing something different. I've been learning JavaScript lately, and so we're going to do this problem. And I'm just going to show you a bunch of different ways that we can do this problem that's not going to focus on the difficulty of the problem, but more on the JavaScript tricks that most people don't know that are kind of useful and can also be transferred to other languages. And I'll explain which ones can work in other languages and things like that. Okay, so this problem is pretty straightforward. So it's just write a function, create counter. It should accept an initial integer in it and return an object with 3 functions. It can increment the value and return it, decrement the value and return it, or reset the value and return it. Okay, so we're going to write it a couple of ways. And so the first way we're going to do it is we're simply going to make an object and then we're going to give it fields. And I'll show you kind of like what you can do there. So you can just say like this, and you can literally just make an object. And now that you made an object, we can just add fields to it. So one way you could do it is like this. So you could say object.init equals init. Another way you could write this is also like this. Either one of these. I think because there's an init variable, the proper way to do it is actually going to be like this. This is going to be the better way to do it because then this is guaranteed to be a string. So when you do this dot notation, this thing on the right is not going to be this. It's actually going to look more like this. So if you were to write it this way, you'd want to do something like this. Because if you write it like this, this will take this init value, and that's what you don't want. Okay, so we can do something like this. And this would be the equivalent in Python of just doing, like this is a key. So this is a key, and this is a value. Okay, so let's do the rest of these. So we could do object dot value equals init. So we're going to set it to init. Now we're going to say object dot, we're going to want an increment method. And so one way you could write it is you can just write like a function. And so what you can do is you can say, okay, it's a function that takes nothing. And what does it return and what does it do? So we're going to want to increment the value, right? So we could say this dot value plus plus, and we can return this dot value. That's one way to do it, and I'll show you a couple others. So we're going to want decrement. We can just copy this code. Let's see here. Okay, so now it's just minus minus. Okay, and then we have a reset. So we have this dot value equals this dot init. So if you want to access variables that are like in the object itself, you can use this. And so we need to return this dot value. So I think that should work. Now at the very end, we simply need to return the object, right? We made an object, now we need to return it. So this should work. Let's just test it. Okay. Okay, so that works. Let's do a couple other things now. So one thing we can do is we can use anonymous methods. So you can use anonymous methods, but the problem is when you have the this in anonymous methods, it's not going to work well. So you generally don't want to do that. But we will edit this up a bit to be able to do that. So now let's try to, instead of actually making an object and setting all these fields, let's actually just return an object with all these fields. So that's another way we could do that, right? And so it would look like this. So we can just say return an object. And then we can just have all these fields, and that would look like this. So we can have, now we can just put in key value pairs directly. So we can just say init is init. And then remember in key value pairs, you need commas. So then we're going to have a value. We're going to set that to equal to init as well. We're going to have a function, and this is going to be increment. So we can do it like that. That's fine. Let's just tab this here, comma. Okay, we can actually copy this. So this decrement minus minus. We want to have this all spaced out reasonably well. Okay, and then we want to have finally the reset, right? So this is going to be this dot value equals this dot init and return this dot value. Okay, so now we can get rid of all of this code. And now let's just make sure all our stuff is good here. Okay. So I think we're good there. Let's see if we have any errors. Let's see. Increment invalid shorthand property initializer. Let's see here. Oh, right. So they're not equals anymore. They're keys and values. So with keys and values, we need this kind of thing. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's another way you can do it. Now, the nice thing about JavaScript, and I don't think too many people know this, is JavaScript has something known as closures. And so what happens is when you make a function or an object in another function, so like we have this function create counter, and when we use it, if we make another function in it, or if we make an object in it and we return that object, we can actually set variables here. So we can say something like let value equals init, and whenever we return this, like each time we create a copy of one of these objects or functions, these objects or functions actually have access to this value and as well as the arguments that were passed into this function. So when we return this object, it's going to have access to this value and this init. And then whenever we make a new object, it's going to have access to its own value and init. So if you make a bunch of objects and you can update init, you can update value or init in one of them, it won't change the other. They're all different. And so what that allows us to do is we can get rid of these. And now we can so now it's not going to be this dot value, we can just modify the value in the init directly. So anything that's an argument or we declare outside of the object we make, we have access to with a closure. And so it's really nice because you kind of you can give a function its own like variables that it can use. That is pretty rare. And you can actually do this also. So this does work in Python. Except in Python, I think what you have to do is when you use these values that were made outside of a function is you have to say non-local, and then you can use it as well. So if you say non-local value, then you can do the same thing. And so let's actually use that closure property to not have to have all these thises. So we can just modify the value directly. And yeah, like I said, if you make a bunch of these objects, like if you make create counter, object 1, object 2, their values and their inits are going to be different. Even you can pass it the same init, and they're going to be different. They're not going to like override each other or anything. Okay, so now we can get rid of these thises because now this init and this value aren't actually part of the object. So let's just make sure this is right. So value plus plus, yeah, looks good. Let's see what happens. Okay, so that works as well. Now another trick we can use is because in JavaScript you have these plus pluses, so you can actually make these in one-liners. So if you do return value plus plus, what that would actually do is it would return the value and then it would actually increment this, which would still work, I think, but you're going to want, like what we want to do is we want to increment first and then we want to return value. So we can actually do something like this, and this works in other languages as well. I think it works in like C++ and Java. Since we have the prefix incrementer, that means we're going to increment first and then we're going to return. And so that's what we want to do, right? For an increment, we want to increment, then we can return. So we can actually make this a one-liner. And we can do the same thing for the decrement. We can also make it a one-liner. Okay. And this, we can't make a one-liner, but that's okay. Now, notice that we don't have a this anymore. So we can also simplify this even more. Remember I said we can't use the anonymous functions because we had this values, and when you have this values, it's not going to work in anonymous functions. But now that we don't have this values, we can actually even simplify this code to use anonymous functions. And so what anonymous functions look like is you have input parameters, and then you have something like this, and then you have the output parameters. So I believe because this is just a one-liner, we can literally just do this, and then we can have a comma. I'm not entirely sure, but let's see what happens. I know we can definitely do something like this. Let's just experiment, right? So that works for sure. So let's just try to do something like that. and then let's see how smaller we can get it. So let's decrement here with these anonymous functions, and we can do return minus minus value. Now we can have their set as well. So their set is not a one-liner, so that is going to be okay. So we need to return, but first we need to actually update our value, right? So let's do that. So it's going to be value equals init return value. Okay. Now let's see. So normally when you do have one-liners, you don't actually need these brackets as well, but I'm not sure how it would work with keys. So let's find out. Yeah, so it looks like it's giving us an error because we have commas. So I think we do want to leave that. Maybe there is a way to do it without these, but we got it to look way cleaner now. We don't need like actual variables in the object itself. We can use the closure. And so what other things can we do? Well, I kind of showed you like pretty much most of the ways. You can also, so an object does have its prototype, but that's kind of similarly to what we did in the beginning, you know, where you create an object and then you can add things to it. So when you have the object, like you have value, you can do value dot and so on to give it more stuff. Now another thing we can do, obviously, is we can use a class. And so this is like probably the last way I'm going to show you. And so the way the class works is pretty straightforward, right? So we're going to have a class, and we can just call it like counter or something, right? And so a class has a constructor, and the constructor is going to take init. And so what's going to happen here is now you're actually going to want to initialize every single variable in the class. And because we use a class now, we actually need to make this init in this value. So we can just say this dot init equals init, this dot value. And this is most similar to Python, right? Like in Python, you don't really make objects with typically with methods. You'd rather make it in a class. That's like the most common way. But it's pretty similar where you do have the same constructor, and instead of this, use self in Python. But other than that, it's pretty similar. So this dot value equals init, and so now we can write these functions in here. So we can have an increment, and the way it works in JavaScript is you have a function here, and because they're in the class, you don't need to say like function and increment. They have to be functions. And so we can do the same thing, though we can still do the one-liner. So we can do this dot value plus plus. So that will still work. We can have a decrement. And we can do the same thing. And finally the reset. So we don't want them to be anonymous functions now, because then they're in the class. We actually want to define them. So step value equals init, return step value. Okay, and so now what we can do is we can get rid of this, and we can actually use this create counter to create this, and then we can return it, right? So yeah, so we're going to want to create it, and then we're going to want to return it. Also, I don't think people really use var anymore. They use let, but that's okay. I don't want to change it. Okay, so what we're going to actually do is we are going to say, whenever we make a constant, we can just make like a constant object equals. So we can call counter, we can make it, and we can pass in this init. We can actually not even use this constant object. I think we can just straight return. I think that would work as well, right? So we make an object, and then we pass in it, and then we just return it right away, and it should be able to do everything. So that would be like the shortest way. I think that should work. Let's see, maybe it didn't. Interesting. So maybe I do need to make an object. Okay, so let's try that. Oh, let's see here. Constructor. Oh, right. So I actually forgot something. So let's actually try one more time to do this. Let's try return new. I forgot the new counter. There we go. Now let's see what happens. Let's see here. Oh, so this should be this dot init. Let's see. Okay, so that actually didn't work. Okay. And so those are just like all the ways I wanted to show you how to make variables in JavaScript. And there's just like a ton of diversity. You can use classes, you can use the prototype, You can use closures, you can make anonymous functions, you can do all these things. And so hopefully you guys learned something new in this video, and if you liked it, then please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I'm probably going to make a little bit more of these JavaScript videos. Let me know if you like them, or if you want me to just stick to Python videos. And thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.